the questions that people always ask is, did Washington actually want to be president? And the answer is no, not really. He had been commander-in-chief of the Continental Army for 8 years during the Revolution. He had only come home to Mount Vernon once for a couple of days in those entire 8 years. He was tired. He liked being here. He knew that there was only one direction his reputation could go, and that was down, because he was so revered and so respected, and he knew that politics tends to do the opposite of that to people. He understood that he was the only person that could be the first president because he was the only person that had the national stature. Not that many people were well known nationally. He was the only person that could be trusted with that kind of power at the time. He had already had enormous power and famously gave it back. And he was the only person that they really thought would actually do a good job making the decisions to establish what the office should actually be. When he was elected unanimously. He was the only person ever to have done so twice. And he sort of reluctantly accepted that position and left his beloved home, which you can see here. We are always doing renovation work to try and maintain these historic buildings. Old buildings require a lot of love and care, which we are doing both to the clerk's office, which is this building here, where we're repairing the roof, as well as the main mansion, which is getting basically a complete foundation rebuild, because 300-year-old buildings in Virginia need sometimes some assistance. And you can see with this incredible view why he liked being here, why he didn't want to leave, and why he didn't want to go to Philadelphia, especially, you know, in the summer when it's hot and disgusting and gross. You don't have air conditioning, it's muggy, and instead you could be someplace like this. When Washington lived here, he had, at various periods of time, up to 300 enslaved individuals that lived on the entire estate. And they would have grown things like wheat and corn and vegetables. He also had a distillery and a grist mill, so some people would have been working there to take the excess grain and produce it into whiskey, or to put it into barrels and ship it elsewhere. So a lot could be produced here. They also had hogs and sheep and chickens to produce meat, and they fished. They had a massive fishery on the Potomac. A lot of excess was sold in Alexandria, which was one of the biggest ports at the time and a really important site of commerce, and it was pretty easy to get there on the river. But they also were consumers of goods from around the world. And in fact, this is one of the things that led Washington to be a revolutionary in the first place, because he liked to buy fine goods from London and France and China and all these other places, and found it very frustrating that he was being sort of circumscribed and funneled into the British imperial system. When he left to go to the presidency for the first time, to go take his oath of office, he wrote to his friend Henry Knox that he felt like he was a prisoner going to the place of execution, which is not, usually the sentiment we associate with a presidential inaugural. But he understood how much pressure was going to be on every single decision, how much pressure was going to be on him to establish smart and wise precedents for those that followed. And so every single thing he did was going to be a first. And it never really wavered, because new things continued to crop up for the entire 8 years he was in office. Very little was actually written down. The Constitution is incredibly short as a document. The original version was only 4,000 words. And Article 2 was very tiny. And so much of what he was supposed to do as president just wasn't articulated. It wasn't put in statute. It wasn't described in any way. And he had to kind of fill out what I call the fuzzy bits of the presidency. How do you dress? How do you interact with people? Yes, you're supposed to work with the other branches of government, but how? Like, what does that look like? We often talk about the big precedents, things like executive privilege, or the first to veto, or even leaving after 2 terms. But it's really so much more than that, because it was establishing the character of the office and how one is supposed to comport oneself when president. Early on in Washington's presidency, there was a bit of a military debacle. The American Army under Arthur St. Clair suffered a terrible defeat against Native American nations out west. And in the aftermath of that, Congress actually established a committee to try and figure out what had happened, why it had happened, and to try and prevent such a disaster from happening again in the future. And this is the first time that Washington actually considered using or asserting executive privilege. And he decided not to. They put together another armed force and changed command, but Washington wanted to make sure that the American people had an explanation for what had happened, and Congress had an explanation. And he felt like sharing the information wouldn't be harmful to what we would call today to be national security. And so he didn't assert executive privilege, and he expressed his belief in the importance of congressional oversight. And I emphasize that because even though he later in his presidency did assert executive privilege, he was always very mindful of recognizing the important role of Congress. He was not trying to dominate Congress. He was not trying to be what you might call today a unitary executive. He was asserting himself, but he was also in recognition that this other branch was really, really important. 1793 was the next big moment. France declared war on Great Britain, and very quickly it sort of embroiled the United States. And everyone of common sense knew that there's no way that the United States could be in another war. They didn't have an army, they didn't have a navy, so they had nothing with which they could fight. But also they were just beginning to recover from the revolution, and financially, environmentally, emotionally, physically, and so really desperately needed to not do that. And so Washington had to navigate what it means to be neutral, which is actually much more complicated than it sounds. Both how do you keep the American people out of the war, but also what behavior can foreign actors do on American soil and in American harbors that is not war behavior. The cabinet was quite instrumental in helping him draft basically a series of rules of neutrality, which Congress then adopted and said, yes, these rules make sense. And they also requested the recall of the French minister, whose name was Citizen Edmond Charles Genet, which was the first time they had done so. And when France accepted that request, it was basically a tacit acknowledgement that the United States, as a sovereign nation, has a right to assert its own foreign policy and demand that foreign visitors respect it on American soil. So it was a really critical moment for the presidency because it was Washington taking action and being decisive when Congress was out of session. The next moment I would take us to would be the Whiskey Rebellion, which occurred in 1794 over a tax on whiskey distilleries. It largely impacted the Western territories because it was really hard for them to get their crops to eastern ports to sell them. And at this point, the United States didn't really have access to the Mississippi River. So instead, they would often distill the excess corn or grain and turn it into alcohol and then sell that. And it was much easier to ship and much easier to sell. This protest had been going on for a couple of years, but it turned violent in 1794. Washington, with his cabinet's advice, once again, decided to send out a number of commissioners to try and come up with a peaceful solution to this problem. When that didn't work, he then called up the militias of 5 states, including Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and went out west to crush the rebellion. Now, critically in this moment, Washington gathered the militia, but then he turned around and came back to Philadelphia. He did not go with the troops to crush the protest. And I think that's because he didn't want to be seen arresting his own citizens. So he sent these forces out west. Most of the rebels immediately dispersed. And those that were rounded up, many of the cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence. The ones that were convicted, however, Washington pardoned. And he pardoned because they expressed remorse, they expressed contrition for their actions, they declared their loyalty to the Constitution, and had mostly lived lives that were respectable and good prior to this rebellion. Many were actually veterans of the Revolutionary War. So we have arrived at Washington's tomb here. It's a very special spot. We are always very grateful to welcome visitors here. A lot of heads of state, people from around the world will come and pay their respects. Washington recognized that, at least in this case, the point was not to crack down in a harsh way. The point was to demonstrate that the federal government had the right to pass taxes and to enforce them. And if citizens didn't like them, then they could protest peacefully, they could speak to their congressman. There were a lot of other forms of recourse. So once the taxes had been enforced, then he could afford to be merciful. And that established a very important precedent for his successors, that mercy is something that presidents can give, and they should from time to time. The last moment from his presidency that I think is worth highlighting was his decision to retire. Most people know about the farewell address, actually a published address that was in the newspapers because it was the best way for him to reach the maximum number of citizens. It was his retirement announcement. It also shared a number of concerns about the future of the United States. These are, I think, sometimes a little bit misunderstood because what he wasn't saying in this address was that parties were bad or that treaties were bad, but rather if we allow our partisan identity to take over and to be more powerful than our American identity, then it will tear us apart. Or if we allow ourselves to be embroiled in foreign affairs such that our loyalties to foreign nations cause us to do something that either is bad for the good of the nation or, again, tears us apart because we have different foreign loyalties, that is what's damaging. Now, obviously, those concerns are incredibly prescient and have proven to be relevant generation after generation. But I actually think that what came next was perhaps more important because it wasn't just the act of announcing retirement, it was also the act of ensuring that the transition took place, because that hadn't been done. Yeah. They were living in the moment of the French Revolution, when the most recent transition they had seen was characterized by guillotines and blood literally running through the streets. And so the American people had to be taught how to participate in a, competitive election, how to participate in the process of transferring power from one person to another, to learn to cherish that as a central part of what it means to be a republic. And Washington understood that that had to happen in an intentional fashion. It couldn't just happen when he died randomly. Right. And if it happened while he was alive, his presence would provide a great deal of stability to that. So that brings us to John Adams. John Adams was vice president for all 8 of Washington's years. He never once attended a cabinet meeting. I should say that the cabinet is one of Washington's most important and most underappreciated creations. It was the subject of my first book called The Cabinet. It's so essential because the cabinet isn't in the Constitution, and yet every president has had one. Washington realized he needed that type of advisory body to provide him with a lot of different forms of feedback, a lot of different ideas that helped him to think outside of the box.
Which is a tactic he used when he was general as well.
That's right. And so basically, when he decided he needed a cabinet, he essentially copied and pasted all of the practices that he had found to be most helpful in the councils of war during the Revolution directly into the presidency. What he understood was that he didn't have all the answers, and he needed support and advice from people who had different backgrounds and expertise from him. Now, he did not ever invite John Adams into the cabinet, and he didn't ever say why, which is very frustrating. Washington doesn't always write down his reasoning for things, which drives me crazy. As a historian, I'm like, tell me your reasoning. But we can, I think, surmise that he just he wasn't that close with Adams, and he didn't necessarily trust his political judgment. So when Adams came into the presidency, he was in this incredibly impossible situation because it's hard for us to wrap our minds around what Washington meant to the American people in 1797. We don't have a figure that is worshipped like he was. I mean, the closest I can think of is like Dolly Parton maybe, but she's not a political figure. Yeah. Imagine a political figure that's that loved and revered. Imagine coming in after that, knowing that whatever you do is going to fall short in comparison. And if you try and diverge from that model, you're going to be criticized for it. So Adams knew that whoever came second was going to have a terrible time. And yet he did it anyway, which I think showed really remarkable political courage, because he knew someone had to be in this spot and someone had to prove that the presidency would work for someone else, for anyone else. Mm-hmm. In my second book, Making the Presidency, I write that George Washington created the presidency, but John Adams defined it. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is he had to figure out how to use the powers of the office, how to work with the other branches of government, how to interact with foreign nations, how to lead the American people as a mere mortal. And that was an incredible challenge, one that he knew was going to be awful and did it anyway. And his presidency was characterized by, I think, two primary fights. One was trying to have an honorable peace with France, because hostilities with France had really kind of ramped up. And two was trying to defend the character of the presidency as Washington had used it. So Washington had had enormous power over the executive branch. He hadn't shared it with the cabinet. He had spoken with the cabinet. He had valued the cabinet, but he had the final decision. And while he very much respected Congress, he also asserted himself against Congress. And Adams really was trying to do the same to ensure that the executive didn't become an executive by committee like we would see in Great Britain today with the Parliament and the Privy Council and the cabinet, things like that.
Was it obvious that Adams was going to become the second president when Washington was still president? I don't remember how that
No, it's
did
a
he
great
prepare
question.
him much, or?
No, he didn't. They really didn't talk much at all, and it wasn't necessarily obvious. So Washington did not actually announce that he was retiring until September of 1796. And the election took place basically starting right away, and then the final day that they could cast votes was early in December. So the entire campaign season was essentially just a couple of months. And this was actually by design, because Alexander Hamilton said to Washington, if you delay it, it will make it less contentious, and it will give basically their opponents less time to gear up a big political fight. So the leading Federalists in Congress were trying to figure out who their candidate should be, and they decided on John Adams because he had been vice president and sort of was the person physically closest to Washington in terms of, like, obviously next in line. He was a New Englander, so it'd be good to have some regional balance after having a Virginian president, and also he was considered to be sort of the heir as vice president. So they selected him, and then he competed against Thomas Jefferson. It was a very close election. He only won by 3 electoral college votes. So it was in no way a sure thing. So today we have the expectation that when a president goes out of office, either at the end of a term or if something, God forbid, should happen to them, then the cabinet gives a pro forma resignation. They all resign. And if the incoming president wants to keep some of them, he or she can, but is not required to. That precedent did not exist. And so Adams was looking at this cabinet, looking at trying to build an administration, and what he thought was, well, if I get rid of Washington's cabinet, maybe that will be seen as a rebuke against Washington. He knew how hard it was for Washington to actually fill vacancies. The cabinet was not the prestigious position it was today. It was very hard work, very low paid, travel was horrible, so you were away from your family for months at a time. He figured, well, these are people from my own party, and Washington would tell me if something was wrong with them, and so I'll just keep them. That was not a great idea. It would actually turn to be probably, I think, Adams' biggest regret, because they were very extreme Federalists. They were on the extreme wing of the party. They were much more loyal to Alexander Hamilton than they were to him. And they, in some cases, were either bad at their job or were really constitutionally inappropriate for their job. So, for example, Timothy Pickering, who was the Secretary of State, he believed he was the smartest person in the room all the time, despite, being in the room with some of the greatest minds in American history. He thought he was never wrong. He thought that compromise was a moral failing, and anyone who disagreed with him, including the president, was an enemy to be crushed. That is not the personality type you want in charge of diplomacy. It doesn't go very well. And so Pickering really spent his entire time as Adams's Secretary of State trying to undermine his foreign policy, trying to thwart the president's agenda, campaigning against him, and so was truly probably one of the worst secretaries of state in American history. Adams had the really unfortunate position of coming in between Washington and Jefferson, which was going to be horrible for anyone's legacy, I think, but also the bad fortune of living at the same time of two of the all-time greatest propagandists. Jefferson was brilliant with his pen, and Hamilton was brilliant with his pen. And they waged very competitive sort of campaigns against Adams in the election of 1800. Hamilton didn't want Adams to be president. And so he wrote this horrific pamphlet, which was dozens and dozens of pages, attacking Adams in many ways for things that Hamilton himself was guilty of. Vanity, thinking he was never wrong, not being willing to listen to anybody, things like that. Jefferson was also competing against Adams at this point. And so it was sort of a lose-lose situation for Adams, but it was also a lose-lose situation for his legacy, because he didn't really have a party to defend his honor. The Federalist Party was much more aligned with Hamilton, and the other party was much more aligned with Jefferson. And for reasons I can't totally articulate, historians tend to take Hamilton and Jefferson with a grain of salt or a bucket of salt, depending on what they're saying, except for when it comes to Adams. They tend to take Hamilton and Jefferson's criticism of Adams at face value. And so if you're living with two of the greatest propagandists and people believe every word they say, you're not going to be remembered all that fondly.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you found in your scholarship much validation of what Hamilton and Jefferson said about Adams, or was there some, and maybe that's why?
Yeah, well, I think there's often a grain of truth. So for example, he could be vain, he could be stubborn, he did have a temper. The thing is he was very aware of those flaws and worked pretty hard to combat them, and often they particularly criticized him when he disagreed with them. But sometimes he was right. And so their criticism, while maybe he was being stubborn, he was being stubborn on behalf of a virtuous thing. And so I think that they often need to be taken with a grain of salt, given who they're coming from. You know, we've just lived through a political campaign cycle, and we know that all campaign materials are not necessarily to be taken at face value. One of the questions that I often get when I was writing a book on Adams is people would say, are you out of your mind? Didn't David McCullough write like a best-selling book on John Adams that was made into an HBO miniseries? And the answer was yes, of course he did. And my book is in no way a disagreement or a correction to, but rather history is written based on the questions we ask. And the questions we ask are based on what we have lived through, or what we have seen, or what interests us. And all of the biographies of John Adams, anytime you have a life that's that full and you're writing a one-volume book that can actually be physically picked up, you're going to have to leave some stuff out. And so most biographies tend to leave out the presidency because they treat it as the low point of John Adams' political service. And I, after witnessing January 6th, realized that I was taking the peaceful transfer of power for granted. And if I was taking it for granted, having spent many, many years studying American institutions, then probably some other people were too.
Just a few.
Just a few. And I wanted to have a better understanding of where did these practices come from? How did they emerge? How did they start? Because they're not really written down. And in that investigation, I realized how unbelievably essential John Adams was to that creation, because, of course, Washington starts it with the farewell address. But you have to have a second person that's willing to participate. And then the second round in 1800 to 1801, he's also there. So he's sort of the central common denominator. And the biographies of Adams had been written before January 6th. So those biographers just hadn't seen a contested transition. And so they couldn't ask those questions. And so it is in no way a correction, but just an addition that hopefully helps us better understand what I think is the bedrock of what it means to be a republic, is to have that peaceful transfer, and how important it is to our continued survival.